It is my very great pleasure to introduce Barbara Combs-Lee, who has practiced as a nurse and physician's assistant for over 25 years. She's been a managed care executive. She's a lawyer. She served as counsel to the Oregon State Senate. She's currently the president of Compassion and Choices, which is the nation's largest nonprofit, working to improve care and expand choices at the end of life. She was the chief petitioner for the Oregon Death with Dignity Act, as well as the leading advocate for the End of Life Options Act here in California. She's a leader in the national fight, advocating death with dignity legislation across the country. She has devoted her life to individual choice and empowerment in healthcare. Barbara's here today to talk to us about the End of Life Options Act, which was made a law in California on October 5th, 2015. After 24 years of debate, why was this law passed now? What changed? What rights has it granted us? Does the law go too far or not far enough? These are some of the complex questions that Barbara will try to help us answer today. Please show your appreciation and welcome Barbara Combs-Lee.
Thank you for that very warm introduction. When this talk was scheduled, we had not been successful in passing the End of Life Options Act in California. So it was kind of hypothetical. This could have been a talk about a failed effort and about an ongoing campaign. So how prescient you were to schedule it just at this time. As Terry said, I've been involved in this issue for a long time, since about 1991, when the issue first came before a committee of the Oregon Senate that I was staffing. And that was the triggering moment. I'd had a lot of experience as a nurse and as a PA before that. Of course, I'd seen a lot of deaths. I'd seen deaths that were just so cruel and inhumane that they made impressions on my consciousness. And I'd also participated and seen deaths that were so gentle and serene. And only years after did the psychological impact of bearing witness to those two very different kinds of deaths come to be of such use to me as an advocate. So it was in 1991 that I was first sensitized to how important being empowered with choice and control is to someone who is facing the last few weeks or months of their life and might have tremendous fears about what kind of suffering might accompany their downward spiral into death. There was a bill that was introduced in the Oregon Senate that got very short shrift, even though the bill's sponsor was probably the most revered person in the whole Senate. He himself was dying of prostate cancer. They called him the conscience of the Senate. He'd been in the Senate for a long time. He was married to the governor. You'd think his bill would have gotten serious consideration. It did not. And that experience taught me how consumers have no voice. When policymakers say, let's get the stakeholders together and we'll get them all around the table and we'll consider everyone's perspective. Who are the stakeholders in terms of the policymakers? They are the providers, they are the hospitals, the institutions, the carriers. They are not the patients. They're not, the patients are not invited, and certainly not terminally ill patients. So when I read a notice in my church bulletin that a group of people was gathering to draft a death with dignity bill and put it on the ballot in Oregon, I volunteered because I knew something about bill drafting at that time, and then just one thing kind of led to another. And I became one of the drafters of the Oregon Death with Dignity Act, and I think I must have missed a meeting where they decided who was going to be the spokesperson. And it was me. So that was a vibrant campaign, a very aggressive campaign in 1994 and 1997. Now, you have in California a bill that is very like the Oregon law. So when I talk about the Oregon law, you can expect that as it is implemented, California would experience the same kind of impact on end-of-life care and end-of-life, I would say, psychology, as we have experienced in Oregon over the last 18 years. It was passed in 94. We had to vote again on it in 97. It was implemented in the first month of 1998, so we have 18 full years of experience with the Oregon law. So I used to present a lot of data when I would talk about the Oregon law, because there is a lot of data. If we stacked up all the peer-reviewed medical investigations that have been conducted on every aspect of the Oregon Death with Dignity law, just the ones that have been published in peer-reviewed journals, I think the stack would be about this high. There's really nothing we don't know about the people who choose it and why and what their experience is and what they're dying of and what their socioeconomic background is and what the experience is like for their families, what hospices do, what the experience does to the patient-physician relationship, what kind of doctors get involved, what it does to doctors when they do get involved, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll just summarize a few what I think are kind of key pieces of data that have come out. And then a few years ago, I thought, well, instead of presenting all these data in presentations, why don't I just kind of consolidate it in one academic journal? And so the Annals of the New York Academy of Science was kind enough to publish that article, and I think that's outside. For those of you who are kind of data junkies, you can get a little encapsulation of all the data about the Oregon law. So, first, a little bit about Compassion Choices. Compassion Choices is the leading organization that does advocacy. We're actually rooted in service. We do individual consultation. People call us from all over the country and ask us for information to help them navigate the very difficult shoals of advanced illness leading into their end-of-life experience. And we share with them all kinds of options. We help them talk with their doctor. We help them talk with their families. So service is our original orientation. And from service, we went to advocacy. And we are in state houses and courthouses, in public squares all over the country. Aid in Dying is kind of our hallmark legislation, but we champion legislation of all kinds. We're responsible, actually in California, for the bill that requires continuing medical education in pain and palliative care for California physicians to retain their licensure. That happened in 2006 or 2005, I think. So we've really been on the forefront of advances in palliative care for a long time. Medical aid in dying is what is called the California End-of-Life Options Act does. The first time that this practice was authorized was in Oregon in 1994. This is Peter Goodwin. This is Dr. Peter Goodwin. There were 3 of us who were co-petitioners, who were the people who actually presented the signatures to the Secretary of State. And Peter was one. Peter was a very, very highly regarded, revered Oregon physician, taught family practice at Oregon Health and Science University for many, many years. A dear man, and I was so proud to be a co-petitioner with him. This was taken when he was pretty ill. He had a neurodegenerative disease that robbed him of a lot of his ability to move, and when he became terminal, Peter did avail himself of the law that he was so instrumental in passing. Hi, Peter. And then in 2008, look how long it took. And during almost that entire time, we were defending the Oregon law in one way or another. We went to the U.S. Supreme Court twice, every every branch of government, the executive branch, the Oregon legislature, Congress. So when it was finally secure in 2006, after that it was really available to, for other states to follow the Oregon lead. So in 2008 was the Washington ballot initiative. 2010, the Montana Supreme Court ruled in a case that Compassion and Joyce's brought that there was no law against aid in dying in Montana, and so this could be incorporated in standard medical practice, and it has been. In 2012, the Vermont legislature was the first legislative body to itself pass a Oregon style or any style medical aid in dying bill, and then of course the California legislature just recently, truly a landmark effort, and the biggest thing, as far as I'm concerned, to happen in our movement since 1994. How many people use it and what impact does it have? This is Fred Nelligan. He's a person who used the Oregon law in order to die, took life-ending medication in November of 2014. He was dying of ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. And when he reached a quality of life that was just unacceptable to him, he took medication and had a peaceful death. He was a geologist, wonderful man. It turns out lots of people in Oregon talk about aid in dying. They talk about it with their family, or they talk about it with their doctor. 1 in 6, that's a lot. 30,000 people, 35,000 people die in Oregon every year. So 1 in 6 talks about it, maybe says to their family, hey, you know, I'm thinking about that death with dignity. What do you think? Could you guys support me? It's a tremendous benefit for opening the conversation and getting these very difficult issues out on the table. 1 in 50 begins the process somehow, and it is a long process. Begins the process by usually talking with their physician. Would you support me? This is my first request. In the end, only 1 in 500 dies by ingesting the medication. So all along the way, there's an enormous number of people who benefit from frank, honest, forthright conversations, easing their fears, talking about pain management, symptom management, being reassured their doctor, their family will be there for them at the end. It turns out only 1 in 500 finds themselves in that unbearable suffering of which they are most fearful, for which they have saved this medication, and they opt to take it. So the impact is great, but it's not restricted to those people who actually ingest life-ending medication. Well, our world changed, of course, when this young woman, Brittany Menard, came to us almost exactly a year ago in September of 2014 and said, I am dying of glioblastoma. I moved from Oregon in order to avail myself of the Oregon law. I have my medication. She already had her medication. She'd gone through the whole process before she contacted Compassion Choices. I would like to do whatever I can to change policy in my home state and maybe the country, so other families don't have to go through what my family has gone through, uprooting everything, moving our household, our family, our dogs, everything to Oregon in order to qualify, so I don't have to live through the devastating impact of seizures, pain, stupor, unconsciousness that will come with glioblastoma, what the glioblastoma will do to me. So she became a spokesperson. I think of her as a prophetic witness. She was so compelling, such a charismatic character, that when her video went online, People magazine, in October 6, 2014, her video was posted. By that afternoon, it was the most watched YouTube video on any Time Warner property online. By the time she died, 30 days later, a little bit more than 30 days later, a little less, 100 million people worldwide knew who she was and what she stood for. Amazing. But she had gone through the entire process, and this is just a little encapsulation of the process. Patients need to make 2 requests verbally, separated by 15 days. They may have to make 1 other request in writing. That request has to be witnessed by people who say, I know this person is capable, competent, not suffering from any coercion or influence. It has no impaired judgment. To my knowledge, they are making a voluntary and enduring request. 2 physicians have to make those same determinations, also the determination of eligibility, that is, the person actually is terminally ill, actually is mentally competent. And there are waiting periods. There's a 15-day waiting period. There's a 48-hour waiting period between the written request and the time the physician can actually write the prescription. And then there's very stringent state record keeping. In addition to all this stack of independent medical research that I referred to earlier. So Brittany had already gone through all that before she contacted us. Most people who do ingest medication are dying of cancer. Overwhelmingly, they are dying of cancer. Overwhelmingly, they are 60 years or older. Mostly well-educated people. For the most part, well-educated people. Some college. They are overwhelmingly all in hospice. This is a picture of Dr. Rasmussen. Dr. Rasmussen was an oncologist in Salem, practiced in Salem, Oregon. Originally, he was not a supporter. When we campaigned in 94 and 97, Dr. Rasmussen was not really part of our campaign. But being an oncologist, he started getting requests once the law went online, and his patients persuaded him that this was a compassionate thing to do, and he was a very compassionate physician, and he ended up seeing a fair number of patients and serving a lot of people's requests in his practice, in his oncology practice. This is when he himself had glioblastoma, and just a few weeks ago he himself took life-ending medication because he did not want to undergo the kind of degeneration that a glioblastoma brings. This is one of our first patients, Jim Romney. Romney, yes, related to Mitt Romney. Yes, Mormon. School teacher. One of our first spokespeople would talk to the press about why he was choosing aid in dying. He was dying of ALS. And he would talk about how his message to his students, and he was a revered school teacher. When he was sick, he was one of these teachers that the students just kept visiting him and visiting him and visiting him. They couldn't let go of him. And he said, you know, my message to the kids was always stand tall, stand tall. And Jim, he stood tall right to the end. He ended up not ingesting his medication. He ended up dying. He had a catastrophic event and died of that. But what a guy. In all that time, since 1997, 1,327 people have had prescriptions written, and of that number, only 859 have actually ingested their medication. So Jim and many others have had death overcome them while they were still living life as fully and joyfully as they could, content, comforted by the fact that they had what they might call their exit plan, or their safety blanket, or their insurance policy, or their parachute that they keep under their pillow in the fridge or someplace like that. Jim was greatly comforted by having his insurance policy, but he never used it. This is Don James. He was a school administrator. He was dying of prostate cancer, and another person who obtained medication under the law. This was a fine art photograph done by a fine art photographer, Taryn Simon, who was doing a series of portraits, and she came to Oregon and took a photograph of Don James. Early in the implementation, after about 5 years, there was a thorough geographic study done by researchers from Oregon Health and Science University, the Oregon Veterans Administration Hospital, and Providence System, where they surveyed not just people who used the law, they surveyed everybody who died in Oregon that year of certain diseases, and they found there were no unreported medical aid in dying cases. Opponents like to think and persuade others that the numbers are small, but they don't actually represent that there's a lot of abuse going on that we just don't know about. Well, these researchers actually went about looking for it, and they found none. The majority of physicians support the law. With every passing year, more physicians have their concerns allayed, and find that they too are supportive of the law and are willing to entertain and honor their patients' requests. And of course, most physicians, if you ask, would want it for themselves. This is our friend Ruth Gallade. This is one of the 2 times we were in front of the US Supreme Court. She's still alive. I think she's probably still carrying signs like that. She is a feisty woman. Other studies have shown that there is absolutely no disproportionate impact on vulnerable populations. That was one of the other worries, concerns, that poor people, people of color, women, frail people would somehow fall victim to a suggestion that they should make a request. Studies have looked into that and found there just is no evidence of that, no evidence at all. And another concern is that people with disabilities might somehow feel devalued and feel enough devalued that they would make a request or be coerced or influenced to make a request. In the 18 years of implementation, the Oregon Advocacy Services, which is the agency responsible for defending, for looking into and defending complaints against some entity that has injured a person with disabilities, has had not one complaint about anything related to the Oregon Death with Dignity law. So this is the blue lines in this chart. This is every year from 1998 to 2013. We didn't get 14. The blue line is how many people got prescriptions, and the green line is how many people ingested their medication. So you see every year it's never less than a third, and some years it's been more than half. Like look at 2001. More than half the people who had a prescription did not ingest it. Almost everyone who makes application and uses the Death with Dignity law in their death is enrolled in hospice. It is not an alternative to hospice. I really need to disavow people of that thought. It's not as though people say, oh, should I have the very best gold standard in end-of-life care? Or should I get life-ending medication? No, people want and deserve both. People are in no hurry to die just because they make a request on the Oregon Death with Dignity law. They want the very best care to keep them as functional as possible, as long as possible. They want to live a joyful, full life as long as possible. They know hospice is the best way to do that. They enroll in hospice, but if they find they are among the proportion of people for whom hospice really does not have the means, the wherewithal, the ability to mitigate their symptoms and improve the quality of their life and reduce their suffering, then they want to have medication that they can escape their suffering. So 90% are enrolled in hospice. This is an interesting study done by a researcher, a psychiatrist named Linda Ganzini, and she interviewed nurses and hospice personnel, social workers, and asked them about their support. She found 60% of hospice and social workers, hospice and nurses in social workers and nurses in hospice were supportive of the law. 26% were neutral, 14% were opposed to the law. But she also found that the entire universe, there was only one who who opposed a particular one of their patients who had made a request under the law. So even though they might oppose the law in the abstract or in principle, hospice workers still support their patients in their most fervent desires. This is a complicated slide, but it looks complicated, but I've used it enough. I think I can make it simple. This compares, it asked the social workers and the nurses to compare the last patient they had who made a request under the Death with Dignity Act with their patients who don't make requests under the Death with Dignity Act. Was your patient who made a request under the Death with Dignity Act more or about the same? More or much more, that's blue. Less or much less, that's orange. So you don't have to worry about the gray so much. Concentrate on the blue and the orange. So this is an error. It shouldn't say family caregiver. It should say more than or much more than other patients. So they're likely to have actually less. Look at that. Look at all the typos on this slide. Fearful loss of control. That's embarrassing. I'm so embarrassed. But anyway, the bottom line is people who make a request are much more likely than other patients to want to remain in control and to be afraid of losing control. Look how much more blue there is than orange. They're also much more likely to fear loss of independence. They're more likely to fear mental decline. They're more likely to fear burdening others. But look, they're less likely to be depressed or anxious or in pain than the other patients who did not make a request. And then, this is why the typo was on the first one, because the second slide has to do with, well, what about the people who were caring for them? Compare the people who were caring for them in the home of the patients who made a request with the people who were caring for them in the home of the patients who don't make requests. What are their concerns? Again, blue, much more. People who made a request, caregivers of requesters, much more. Orange, much less. Well, oh, didn't change the slide. There we go. Look at the found meaning in the care. More. They're more likely to have found meaning in the care. They're more likely, blue is greater than orange, to be prepared for a patient's death. Blue is greater than orange, more likely to be accepting of the patient's death. About the same amount of distress, after all, they're in grief, a loved one is dying, but so much less likely to feel burdened by the care. Look, blue is less than orange, and so much less likely to be burdened by the cost of care. Blue is so much less than orange. So all the supposed risk factors and disadvantages that people worried about among requesters, it turns out that for the patients and for their caregivers, those things are much less prevalent than they are in the general population. Oh, this is the United States. This is a study, I love this study because it's so recent, and when we were in that church basement writing the Oregon law week after week, draft after draft after draft, we never imagined that the impact would be so great. We never imagined that it would have such a beneficial effect on palliative care and on physician education and on hospice utilization and penetration. And so it's just been wonderful over the last 18 years to see those things get so much better in Oregon and know that people were attributing it to the Oregon Death with Dignity law. Well, this study was the latest evidence of that. It turns out 18 years ago, when the Oregon Death with Dignity law was passed, hospice penetration, that is hospice utilization, was the big concern. How many people are dying in hospice? Not enough. People aren't getting referred to hospice. Well, now there's been a wonderful change. Hospice utilization has gone up throughout the country. However, problems have emerged. And the problems that have emerged are primarily because of providers, mostly for-profit hospices, learning to game the system. And yes, people die in hospice, but it is not optimal hospice utilization. These researchers looked at hospice stays that were too short. People who were admitted to hospice for 48 hours, 3 days. In other words, they were treated aggressively in an ICU and some intensive care beyond any point where it was likely that these things would do any good. And in the last few hours, when it's clear this patient is dying, no matter what anyone can do, off they go to hospice. So it's registered as a hospice death. Didn't die in the ICU. We get credit for a hospice death, but really, 48 hours? 20 hours? So these researchers said that's abusive. That's a hospice abuse, is hospice stays that are too short. So they looked at every state, and they looked at the states. What are the states that have the lowest incidence of hospice stays that are too short? There they are, and notice Oregon is one of them. Has a very low incidence of too short hospice stays. Okay, then they looked at the other abuse, which was the for-profit hospices going into nursing homes and just signing everyone up for hospice, whether they really qualified or not, whether they really are terminally ill or not. And these people end up being in hospice for months, way beyond the 6-month expectation. Finally, they get discharged live from hospice. And so too long hospice is also what these researchers were categorizing as an abusive hospice trend. People are gaming the system and double dipping. They're getting the nursing home Medicare payment and they're getting the hospice Medicare payment. So they looked at the states and said, what are all the states that have the lowest incidence of this too long abusive hospice pattern? There's Oregon, showing up again. And it turns out there's only one state in the country that had neither trend, neither too short nor too long. The researchers said, we think this is because of the Oregon Death with Dignity Act. And these were researchers, we didn't know who these people were. This is a completely independent conclusion they came up with. We think it's because the populace is educated, people are used to talking about it, people are astute about hospice and its appropriate use, and so inappropriate use trends have not taken hold in Oregon. So that made us feel pretty darn good. What have we learned over the last 18 years in Oregon? Just a few overriding principles. First, I'll introduce you to Jennifer Glass. Jennifer Glass, who was one of our campaigners in the California legislature, a wonderful, wonderfully articulate, beautiful woman dying of lung cancer. She started a blog called At the Top of My Lungs because that's where her cancer was located. She did a project where her husband Harlan took her photograph every single day for a year, and they posted it online. She would talk about why she was testifying in favor of the End-of-Life Options Act, and she would say, people call me fearless. I am not fearless. But I do think I could fear less if I had this option. And she would say, I'm doing everything I can to extend my life. No one has the right to prolong my death. Jennifer did die. She died just a few weeks after she was scheduled to testify again, and she did not have a good death. She did not have a good death. And she didn't live long enough, obviously, to see the law come online. So the lessons we've learned is where you can bring aid in dying out from under the shadows, make it a legitimate, authorized medical practice. It is safe. It is a safe medical practice when we can talk about it, get second opinions, open the conversation, bring the hospice multidisciplinary teams into the conversation, make sure it's the option of last resort. It is a safe medical practice. We've also learned that, as I've said, the purpose of the prescription, when the doctor writes the prescription and says, here's your prescription for life-ending medication, the purpose in the doctor's mind is, this is going to comfort my patient. And the doctor's intention in writing it is met, whether the patient ingests the medication or not. So this is Asia Riggs. She is our plaintiff in New Mexico, who we thought was terminally ill at the time we brought the case 3 years ago, and Asia is still alive and well. Well, she's not well, she's in remission. But she's an example of a person who would derive enormous comfort and may never actually ingest medication. Doctors like guidelines. Doctors are risk averse, and they want to conform to good practice. And so if there is a statutory scheme or a practice guideline that outlines what good practice is, they will adhere to it. This is Eric Kress. He practices in Montana. Montana has no statutory scheme. Montana has a Supreme Court ruling that says there's nothing illegal about this. And so Dr. Kress honors the requests of his patients who come to him. And he uses practice guidelines that are published. There's a new practice guidelines that's just appeared in the Journal of Palliative Care. He practices excellent medical care. He does not have the kind of reporting requirement to the state that we have in Oregon, Washington, and California, because there is no statute in Oregon. But doctors are conservative by nature. That's why they're doctors. They don't take chances with our lives, and they don't take chances with their reputations either. Doctors will adhere to guidelines. And finally, that aid in dying, authorized open aid in dying, improves end-of-life care and palliative care in so many ways. This is Kate Morris. You might recognize her if you've seen a film, an HBO film called How to Die in Oregon. She's a surgeon, and she was the surgeon of a woman who was featured in that film, who is followed, a woman named Cody Curtis. And she's a physician who really, Cody herself brought Kate to an understanding that, as Kate says, yes, I took an oath to do no harm. But what is harm is defined by the patient. Cody, you tell me what would harm you. And Cody said, withholding the choice of a peaceful end of my liver cancer, that would harm me. And so Kate wrote Cody a prescription, and she was there when she died. That's all I have, and I'd like to open it to questions. This is always really kind of the most vibrant part of the talk.
Before we start asking questions, can I just make a request that people keep their comments to specific questions today, and not so everyone gets a chance to, without telling long stories or elaborate questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very heartrending. What is the medication, and what is the result of taking the medication? What is the process that evolves?
For the most part, the medication is a short-acting barbiturate, either secobarbital or pentobarbital. If it comes in a capsule, it's taken out of the capsule, dissolved in water. It's very bitter. People take an antiemetic, something to calm their stomach, about 20 minutes before they're going to take the medication. They take the medication, they need to drink it quickly enough that they don't fall asleep before they consume a lethal dose, so in about a minute. And then there's often a great big yawn, and maybe a little time for a quick goodbye and embrace, and people fall asleep and lean back in their pillow and fall asleep. And gradually the respirations slow, and then the respirations stop, and then the heart stops. People look like they are sleeping. Death usually comes in as short a time as 5 minutes, usually an hour or so, within an hour, hour and a half. There have been a few people who have not died after taking medication, after taking certainly a life-ending dose of medication. And it's impossible to know why that might be for certain. Maybe for some reason the medication wasn't absorbed from the GI tract or something. But what happens if they don't die? They wake up, and they're pretty surprised to be awake, and sometimes pretty angry. And they may choose to take another dose of medication, or they may choose not to. This has happened, I think, about 5 times or so. People who had said, well, I guess it's not my way. I guess, yeah, so they just continue in hospice care.
What about people who are losing their cognitive abilities? And what they're afraid of is, there may be other things wrong with them as well, but what they're afraid of is that by the time they do lose their ability to be of sound mind and to make the decision, that they can't do it at that point, and yet earlier is really too early for them. They still are thinking clearly and want to live for a while longer. How do you handle that?
Right. It is probably one of the most challenging decisions that people holding the medication have to make. What is the right time to take it? Now, if their primary disease is some kind of advancing dementia, they will not qualify under any circumstances, because they will never meet the dual qualifications of being terminally ill and mentally competent. If they are terminally ill, they will no longer be mentally competent. If they're mentally competent, they will be many years from being terminally ill. So it's not for people whose primary illness is Alzheimer's or another progressive dementia. But for people for whom dementia might be an auxiliary of their illness, or stupor and delirium might be a side effect of their pain management, and they don't want to sink into that state of delirium and stupor where they're no longer capable, they do need to make a decision about the window of opportunity. And some don't, they get increasing doses of pain medication, they do become stuporous, and they die, essentially that way, like any other hospice death. I don't view that as a failure in any way. I think people decide to take their medication, and some people decide not to take their medication. And for people who decide not to take their medication, I would honor that decision just as much as I would honor the decision of someone who decides to take it. So it's kind of a passive decision, if you will, but it's a decision nonetheless. For people who, and certainly some people do this, they put up with more pain so they can stay mentally competent, so they can make the decision. And that's, that's another way to go. People just need to have it explained to them what their options are and what the window of opportunity might be. And if they let that window close, I think they end up having a natural death, and that's okay.
Go ahead.
The passage of aid in dying in California is an unprecedented success, not possible without compassion and choices.
Thank you.
But my question concerns the implementation of this law. Just 2 days ago, a friend asked me, with a concrete case in mind, how, who, and when will apply this law. For instance, in this case was that the doctors at Kaiser were completely unaware of the law. Who is going to write the guidelines for physicians when it is going to be applied? Thank you.
Right, thank you for that question, because it highlights something that I am so cognizant of, and that is really kind of one of my watchwords. Passing a law is the first step in social change. Nothing really happens by passing a law. It's hard to pass a law. Heaven knows it was, as you say, a monumental effort to get lawmakers to vote in line with what polling shows people want. But it is still the first step. A whole social change adaptation has to happen. And it's still happening in Oregon. You know, I mean, even in Oregon, we have a campaign that we call Access, the Access campaign in Oregon, because still in some of the outer reaches of the state, patients ask their doctors and they get turned down, or they get an answer like, oh, that law never went into effect, or, oh, you don't qualify, or, no, we don't do that. You know, just kind of get the brush off. So there's a lot of work in educating people about what they can expect, and educating providers about promulgating policies. Now, if Kaiser in California is like Kaiser in Oregon, it will evolve to be one of the most exemplary in its implementation of aid in dying, I have no doubt. Apparently this morning, there was a webinar for California hospitals on implementation of the End-of-Life Options Act. Compassionate Choices participated in that, and I'm waiting to hear how many hospitals were involved and what kind of results. So there certainly is a good faith desire on the part of providers in California to implement this law and to make it available. But there will be a lot of work. Compassionate Choices work will be far, far from finished. And then, of course, well, you alluded to it, we don't know when it's going to go into effect. Because it was kind of idiosyncratic, it was passed in special session, and the Constitution says that laws passed in special session go into effect 90 days after the special session adjourns. The special session hasn't adjourned, because the special session was called to finance a certain Medicaid provisions, and those haven't been passed, and so the governor doesn't want the special session to adjourn until those are passed. In the meantime, there is an effort by opponents of aid in dying to put a referendum on the ballot. If they are successful in collecting enough signatures to make the people of California vote, then the law is held in limbo until after the vote in November of 2016. So we are engaged right now in a decline to sign campaign, hoping that when people have a petition put in front of them, please sign this petition to repeal that terrible End-of-Life Options Act. They say, no, thank you. No, I wouldn't sign that. I want that. So that's not a very concrete answer. It's essentially we don't know. But we're trying as hard as we can and doing everything imaginable to clarify the implementation date, to get it online as fast as possible, and to defend it against the challenge of a referendum.
Yeah, excuse me. I'm one of those Kaiser physicians who served on the bioethics committee and dealt with end-of-life situations for maybe 20 or 25 years. What I'm interested in is whether or not Oregon has a situation where you have a comprehensive meeting of the stakeholders, the patient, if the patient is competent, the family, the providers of medical care, and all interested parties, so that everybody knows what everyone else is feeling. Do you have such a preliminary end-of-life meeting, or is it done just privately with one doctor?
You mean for an individual patient who wants to make a request, how is that request handled?
Right.
Yeah, well, I think that every practice probably has its own policies about that. The law has a requirement that the physician try to bring the family in. And as you know, when a patient enters hospice, they are automatically the center of a multidisciplinary patient-centered team. And so that is a natural form of social worker, medical director, nurses, et cetera, who are all caring for the patient. So there's a natural sort of a circle already in place where discussion happens about the patient's request.
That's a conglomeration of professional caregivers, but I think what I had in mind is that families need to be, in my view, families need to be very much involved in a conscious decision to consider taking one's life. And I'm asking whether, you said that there's a requirement in Oregon that the family be consulted, or there is not?
There's a requirement that the physician talk to the patient about bringing their family in, but I personally think it would be oppressive government to require a patient who is estranged, say a person dying of HIV, to notify or bring into the discussion their long estranged parents. You know, I think that is the essence of patient-centeredness. Yes, everyone should have the benefit of an open dialogue in their loving community, but it's not up to the government to impose who that dialogue should be with, or under what circumstances, or when it should take place. Certainly the law, in many ways, promotes that. I think every practitioner, and certainly hospice, promotes it, but I personally think it would be oppressive government to require it.
I guess I'm not a libertarian. Thank you.
Okay. On the national front, can you discuss the opposition to laws like Oregon's and whether it seems to be changing as a result of Oregon's experience?
Yes, attitudes are changing because of Oregon's experience. Attitudes are changing because of, quite frankly, Brittany Menard. When Brittany's videos and stories were lighting up Facebook and Twitter all across the world, we started getting calls from legislators in states saying, I want to sponsor a Brittany bill. You know, would you help me? That was unprecedented. In 2013, I think there were 4 states in which there were aid and dying bills introduced. In 2015, there were 24. Yeah, enormous. Now, the fortuitous thing is that as the interest rises, the data is there. You know, so Brittany gave people that aha moment of, oh, this is going on. People are having to suffer through the devastating effects of horrific diseases. And if they don't want to do that, they have to either turn to self-help or move to a jurisdiction where aid and dying is authorized. That's not fair. That's not right. That awareness started to dawn at the same time that people could then say, well, how would it work in our state if we were to authorize aid and dying here? And here we have 18 years of experience and data, so meticulously gathered and so comprehensive.
Do you have a state-by-state progress plan? How best can I help you, short-term and long-term? And thank you for being so eloquently articulate. Your kindness radiates throughout this room, and it's very comforting.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, visit our website, compassionandchoices.org, And there is a state-by-state, you can go to that state, you can be put in contact with the people who are functioning in that state, the volunteers, the staff, if we have staff in that state, and you can be kept abreast of what the status is, what the challenges and opportunities are state by state. Thank you for that question.
Oh, yeah. It's sort of a two-parter. The question is, I read in a magazine of, how do you push it? Oh.
You're on.
From a major university, a professor from a major university had dementia, and the family had a party, like a going-away party. She was present, but had already gone through, had some dementia, and she kept saying, that I did that, and I did this, and stuff like that. And then the next day or 2 days later, I don't know, took some medication, and, her own choice, and passed away. Well, you just said that dementia and Alzheimer's are not qualified for this. How did that happen? And aren't you leaving out a whole big section of people that are concerned about losing, their faculties?
Yeah. If she didn't have a concomitant terminal illness, she would not have qualified for the Oregon Death with Dignity Act or the End-of-Life Options Act in California or any other state where aid in dying is authorized, because it's authorized for people who are terminally ill, mentally competent, able to self-administer. Now, that doesn't mean that people don't accumulate by winks and nods or trips to foreign countries or wherever what they know to be a life-ending dose of medication and take it on their own. Or what we often talk with people who are in the early stages of dementia, are still mentally capable, certainly the majority of the time. We talk with them about stopping eating and drinking. You can do this. This is a gentle death. You can be in hospice to treat your symptoms. No one can force you to take food and liquids against your will. So if you surround yourself with supportive, loving family, you make your unqualified, rational, enduring decision that you're going to stop eating and drinking, you can have a peaceful death, and it's perfectly legal, and no one who is there with you, assisting you, helping you with comfort during that period is under any legal jeopardy. Now, I think I know the story you're speaking of, and I think she died alone. I think she didn't.
She lied down next to her husband. It was Stanford University, and it's in their alumni magazine.
So he may face an investigation about whether or not whatever kind of support he gave her rises to the level of assistance. That would be the prosecutorial question. Did he assist, or did he just support her decision? The wonderful thing about authorizing aid in dying is that there's not that uncertainty for the people who are there to comfort and to stand by their loved one. They're immune. This is an authorized practice. No one has to feel guilty or ashamed or have to talk about it or not talk about it, be secret about it. It takes it out from the shadows.
But you're not offering anything to people with dementia. You're not offering anything, and so their relatives may be, sent to jail or something.
Well, what we offer is to support them through stopping eating and drinking.
That sounds like torture.
It's not. It's not. It's not for everyone, definitely. But people who are really and truly ready to die, if you're interested, there's actually a video on our website of a physician who decided to stop eating and drinking, and then he made a little snippet of a film every day for the purpose of telling people how easy it was. And years ago, there was an article published in the Journal of the American Medical Association by a doctor named David Eddy, whose mother stopped eating and drinking, and she wasn't terminally ill. She just had dwindles gradually incapacitated in a number of ways, and then finally she couldn't leave her house, and David Eddy reported that probably the final straw was a rectal prolapse, and that really sort of incapacitated and immobilized her, and so she decided to stop eating and drinking, and she made him promise. She said, David, tell people how easy this is. Tell people this is within everyone's grasp. And so he did. Published it in the Journal of the American Medical Association. That was a number of years ago.
Hi. Many thanks for your articulate discussion. I'm having trouble, other than on religious grounds, why people refuse this sort of legislation. What are the arguments against it? I'm sort of befuddled.
We were talking about this at lunch a little bit. I think there were people, the palliative care community in particular, who had legitimate concerns. They worried that somehow you couldn't craft public policy in such a way that you could protect against coercion or influence, and vulnerable people would somehow fall victim. They didn't know or clear exactly how, with all the safeguards along the way, but that was a concern. One of those people was a man his reputation, he's the most quoted bioethicist in the country. His name is Arthur Caplan. Probably heard a quote from him once or twice. And he was one of those people who had legitimate concerns. I worried about this, and so he didn't actually speak out until 2005 or so. And he waited until the evidence was in, and then he said, my concerns have been allayed. So I think the people who actually had concerns have been reassured by the data coming from Oregon, which leaves me to conclude that the people who continue to voice the same concerns without any proof, without any evidence, are actually just voicing hypothetical concerns, and their genuine reason for opposition is something quite different. And I think the something quite different has to do with two things. Number one, sometimes it is religious doctrine. It's just plain, this is not our place. This is an affront to God to take matters into your own hands. And we shouldn't have public policy that allows people to affront God in that way. That's one reason. And I think the other reason for people who are not allied with that particular doctrinal philosophy is a question of power and authority. And there's something that offends their sense of who should be in charge. They don't like the idea of people having so much agency. Because it really does transfer authority from one side of the scale, the provider scale, to the patient scale. In states without aid in dying authorized, a patient says, how will you take care of me, doc? I don't want to suffer. There, dear. Don't worry. I'll make sure you won't suffer. Well, who's the decider there? The doctor is the decider. I'll decide when you've had enough suffering. I'll decide when it's time to increase the morphine dose, put you essentially into a sedated state, withhold food and fluids so death will come relatively quickly. That's sort of the standard way that people die in hospice. I will decide. And there's something very uncomfortable about a patient coming back and saying, I want to decide. I might be suffering in ways you can't see. Or my suffering might have to do with the violation of the values and beliefs of my lifetime that I don't want to see defiled. I don't want to see them defiled by stupor and delirium and unconsciousness and 100% dependency. Some people might say, that's my idea of suffering, and I want to decide. And for some physicians, for some clergy, for some lay people, it's just uncomfortable to hand individuals that much agency over that much dominion. But they don't talk about it. They don't oppose it in those particular terms.
Thank you. I had two questions. What does the death certificate state as the cause of death? And the second is, what about life insurance policies? Are there problems where they will not pay for a, quote, suicide and any other legal payments that would be coming at a natural death?
Right. The death certificate says the patient died of the underlying disease. Because they did. They would not, but for the underlying disease, they would not have had that life-ending medication, and they certainly would not have taken it. So the underlying disease is the cause of death. It does not have an effect on the suicide waiver, the suicide exclusion in insurance policies. In states where there are statutory provisions, the statute specifically says no contract or contract for insurance shall be affected by whether or not a person uses this law. But it's not as big a problem even in states that don't have statutory authorization, because those exclusions expire after 2 years. They're really intended for people who would defraud the company, who would buy an insurance policy and then jump off a bridge and they're perfectly healthy. The insurance company doesn't want to pay that claim. But the insurance company knows it's going to pay the claim of the person who's dying of brain cancer. It's a question of, do I pay it, maybe in August, or do I pay it in September? So it's not as though the insurance company has a reason to object to payment of the claim when the death was inevitable. So in 18 years, it has not been a problem.
Your data that you talked about, you mentioned that the majority, I forget there was a number, of the people who took advantage of this were highly educated or educated. Do you view that as a positive thing because vulnerable people are not being coerced, or do you view that as a concern because enough people aren't aware of it or aren't accessing it?
Yes. You have pointed out quite accurately the double-edged sword of that particular data piece. I will say this. The majority of people have some college education or high school. And that's a rough parallel, if you know from epidemiology and demographics, it's a rough indicator of socioeconomic status education is. In a state where aid in dying is authorized, certainly people who are not as educated and in a lower socioeconomic stratum have a better shot than in a state where this practice is relegated to winks and nods, and the people of very high social stature who gulf with their doctor are much more likely to be willing to ask him or her to commit a felony. But people who don't know their doctor, who get their care from the emergency room, are not going to bring it up. So it is authorization, and legal protection is an equalizing factor. But still, people who are likely, it is a daunting process. And so people who are likely to undertake that process and carry it through to completion are probably people who have been successful at carrying out projects their whole life, education being one of them.
I have a question that brings us back, I think, to the dementia part. In the law, it says I have to be able to self-administer. Why does that have to be in the law? Why can I not direct, while I'm still saying an alert, someone else to administer? Why does it have to be self-administered?
Because that's the final safeguard. Because that's the final safeguard that assures that it's this person's decision and this person's choice. And the law doesn't require that, you know, you get in the car and go out and drive to the pharmacy and do all the fine motor manipulation. But the law does require that you do some voluntary act that demonstrates to the people in the room, the people who are attending you, your physician, your hospice workers, that this is your decision. I have decided to do it now. And so I'm sipping, I'm swallowing, I'm doing something that is a voluntary act. But for my voluntary act, no one could force this medication on me.
Stand up. You mentioned that half the people who get the medicines don't take it. What is the shelf life of these medicines?
This is a man with a stash.
I didn't get the question.
He wants to know the shelf life of short-acting barbiturates. It's very long. It's very long. It's very long. It's years and years.
Okay, I'm concerned about the use of the word suicide, as in assisted suicide.
Yes.
And I realize that the opponents of the act that hopefully will be finalized here in California, they're gearing up everything. And what I'm also noticing is in the public press, which is read by people of many different socioeconomic levels, assisted suicide is frequently used, and it's very often the head in larger print of an article that accompanies. What is being done about that?
Yes. You know, we are a very goal-driven organization. We have a strategic plan that is one-page, double-sided. It's laminated. Every single Compassion Choices employee has the strategic plan on their desk. Their tasks are tied, on an hour-to-hour basis, are tied to long-term objectives and short-term objectives that are tied to the strategic plan. One of the goals of the strategic plan is that suicide is not the term of reference as measured by the Associated Press Style Guide. That has been
Say that again, please.
as measured by the Style Guide of the Associated Press. Every journalist in the country goes to the Style Guide, as that's kind of their reference for what is the proper way to refer to things. And the Style Guide editors refuse to change. We have presented them with evidence, reasons, grieving families that say, don't say my dad suicided. He died of cancer. It is an affront to me. It hurts people to read that their loved one died of suicide. Or a current patient who is trying, like Jennifer Glass. She says, I am trying to do everything I can to extend my life for someone to call her suicidal. They are intransigent. But there are glimmers of hope. Some peripheral news outlets and some peripheral syndicates are starting to use different language. Every time we see it, we complain. And I charge everyone in this room, every time you see it, write a letter to the editor, write the author of the article. Sometimes the reporter is fine, but the headline writer is the one who goes for the cheap sensation. Right. And the cheap sensation it's about suicide. So, you know, they know how we feel about it, but they need to know that all kinds of people in America feel about this, that you are insulting us when you use the word suicide. You need to make that change.
Returning to an
I don't want this
earlier
to sound hostile, because I actually think you've done a terrific job and support you. But I've got a lot of friends in the disability community, which was one of the communities that opposed this legislation. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you got it through in California, both procedurally and politically, because there was a lot of complaint about the procedures used, and you obviously did kind of a miracle. So I would like to hear about that.
It was a miracle. It looked as though the bill was dead, for those of you who know, because there was a block in the Assembly Health Committee that was going to keep it from going to a floor vote. We believed we could win the floor vote, but they were unwilling to release it from committee. So we instead went to the special session. There was nothing illegal about that. It was something you can't do without leadership guiding the process. Leadership needs to be looking for a parliamentary mechanism to get a law through, and we were very, very fortunate that leadership was in favor of this bill. With regard to people with disabilities who oppose, I'd like to take a little bit of exception to that and say the leaders of disability rights organizations are opposed, some. But I would hasten to say the Disability Rights Legal Center at Loyola University, Disability Rights Legal Center, their job is to defend the rights of people with disabilities, is litigating in California and New York for aid and dying to be constitutionally protected. So it is not monolithic. And as a matter of fact, when we do polls and we oversample for people with disabilities, we find people with disabilities support authorization of aid and dying in about the same proportion as the general population. So it's a little bit of fear-mongering, I think, of spreading fears that have no substantiation. As I said, 18 years in Oregon, no evidence of abuse, not one complaint to the Oregon Advocacy Center. And if you go to Oregon and do a little person on the street and walk up to any person with visible disabilities and say, how do you feel about the Oregon Death with Dignity Act, and do you feel threatened by that? Do you know anyone who's ever been coerced, or do you know anybody who's ever been influenced? You will get support. You will get people with disabilities saying, no, that's my right. I'm glad I live in Oregon, so that it's my decision. When I develop a terminal illness, I'll be able to decide.
Is there an official position of the church?
Well, it depends on the church. It depends on the denomination, and sometimes it depends on the congregation. The statewide Methodist Conference in California supported, on record, supported passage of the California End-of-Life Options Act. So Methodists, very good, solid support. Individual congregations, Presbyterian, United Church of Christ, you will find a lot of support, congregation by congregation. There's only one denomination-wide supportive statement that I know of, and that's the Unitarian Universalists, who way back in 1988 passed at their General Assembly policy that said part of our doctrine is the inherent worth and dignity of every individual, and being able to make end-of-life choices is part of the inherent worth and dignity of every individual.
Everybody, I think we will, one more question, and then I think we'll close for today.
As I understand it, you stated that this was not for Alzheimer's patients because it's not considered a terminal illness. That seemed to me a strange way of precluding people who, at the early diagnosis of Alzheimer's would not be able to say, look, maybe it isn't going to be in 6 months, but if I have this diagnosis, I know where it's leading, and why can't I take advantage, so to speak, of this procedure now?
Right. Alzheimer's is a terminal illness. Alzheimer's will cause your death. So I don't want to make that confusion, but it's what the requirement in the law is to be within 6 months of death, within reasonable medical judgment. And so that is not going to be coincident with mental competence. And I know that is very, very disappointing. But I'll tell you, the law just would not have passed. Right. They wouldn't have a prayer. We would not have a prayer. And although people who feel that way, believe that way, are very fervent in their belief, I'll tell you, we know from our polling, you represent about 15% of the population. 15% of the population. 15% of the population say absolutely no, under no circumstances, no one should ever be allowed to do this. And the vast sea of people in between say, well, maybe if there are really strong safeguards and we absolutely know that only people who can decide and have decided and are making a contemporaneous decision and do it themselves, et cetera, with all the safeguards. So, I very much respect your position. It is not in line with a policy that could get passed because it doesn't have enough public support. It doesn't have enough public support. And I view, Compassionate Choice's job is to represent the views of the majority of people of the country and try and get those in place. So with that, I would thank you very much for your kind attention. And please join us. Please join us. There's so much work to be done, and I would love to have your help. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you.